Hello everyone, and welcome to Earth Archives. Today we're going to talk about a topic that might feel a little sensitive, but is incredibly important, a psychological question. Why are people with a victim mindset often more dangerous than those who directly inflict harm? I've recently encountered some situations like this myself, and I have to say, it made me both curious and a little scared. Remember to subscribe, give a like, and share this with anyone you think might need it.
Haha. Yes, this is a very profound topic. Jung pointed out this paradox long ago. On the surface, a victim seems vulnerable and helpless, but beneath that vulnerability hides an extremely powerful, and arguably one of the most destructive, mechanisms in human psychology. Don't underestimate it. It's not simply a personality flaw or a small trick to gain sympathy. It's a full-fledged dark archetype, a self-maintaining, self-reinforcing psychological structure.
Wait, you mean these people aren't just seeking comfort, they're actually manipulating others' emotions? That sounds pretty sinister.
Exactly. And this kind of manipulation is subtler and more dangerous than direct attacks. We can usually spot direct abusers and protect ourselves, but people with a victim mindset use moral inversion. They turn your empathy into a tool of control. You feel, I have to help him, and before you know it, you're being led along. Psychology even shows that people with high moral standards and more mature psychological development are more susceptible, because we're naturally inclined to protect the vulnerable.
Wow, so kind people are more likely to be exploited? That sounds like a trap.
Exactly. And it's not just a small trick. Jung discovered that beneath the surface vulnerability lies a far more complex and dangerous psychological structure. He defined the pathological victim mindset as a complete dark archetype. It can operate autonomously, almost like a little independent personality outside conscious awareness. That's why the victim role appears harmless or even pitiful, but it can control you and even influence a group or culture.
That's fascinating and scary. How do they actually execute this psychological control?
This brings us to what Jung called the collective shadow and archetypes. People who identify with the victim archetype often don't even realize they're manipulating others. They genuinely believe they are powerless and that the world is unfair to them. But their apparent vulnerability becomes a psychological entitlement. It draws your sympathy and folds it into their control. You want to help, to extend a hand, but your good intentions are co-opted, giving them power.
So if you try to set boundaries or point out their behavior, they see you as cold or unfeeling, and might even blame you.
Exactly. That's one of the most dangerous aspects, psychological contagion. Jung noticed that someone deeply identified with the victim archetype radiates a psychological field that causes guilt, anxiety, and confusion in others. It's similar, but not identical, to the modern concept of trauma contagion. Real trauma seeks healing, but the victim mindset seeks to maintain its suffering as a center of power. It self-reinforces and blocks others from changing.
Wow, that's like an invisible psychological weapon. How does this victim power affect society or groups?
Its impact can be profound. Jung warned that if this dark archetype goes unrecognized, it can become a driving force behind collective movements. Many ideologies or group movements may start from real injustices or oppression, but over time, the victim identity solidifies into a permanent moral authority. The goal is no longer solving problems, but maintaining the identity and influence. This power seems weak, but it can control minds. It's a subtle, deep-layered form of psychological control.
So invisible power is even scarier than direct violence, because you can't see it or fight it conventionally. How can ordinary people protect themselves?
That's where building psychological immunity comes in. The key isn't abandoning empathy. It's about cultivating what psychology calls discernment. Learn to distinguish between genuine emotional involvement and being drawn into manipulation. Stay open and compassionate, but also maintain clear boundaries. Know what is your responsibility and what is a strategy being used on you. This is an advanced psychological skill, and it's something even many spiritual seekers struggle to master.
Wow, this really sounds difficult. But at least just knowing it exists helps us stay alert. Can we go over some concrete signs to identify a pathological victim?
Absolutely. Scholars of Jung and modern psychology point out 5 particularly clear indicators. First, avoidance of personal agency. They refuse to acknowledge or use their own power. Second, turning suffering into a long-term identity and strategic resource, constantly emphasizing their misfortune. Third, moral impeccability. Any questioning is interpreted as persecution. Fourth, creating or reinforcing crises at critical moments, effectively resetting everything. Fifth, shifting responsibility, projecting their emotions, life, and even happiness onto others, and blaming people when they fail to meet hidden expectations. Observed over time, these 5 patterns can help distinguish a pathological victim from someone who is genuinely vulnerable.
Next, let's talk about this triangle. It sounds a bit like the psychological drama triangle. What's that about?
Exactly. This is what Jung and later psychologist Stephen Carman described as the drama triangle. It's made up of 3 roles: the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer. The fascinating part is that these roles aren't fixed to specific people. They can switch rapidly. And from a deeper psychological perspective, they're all different facets of the same dark archetype.
Wait, you mean the same person can sometimes be the victim, sometimes the persecutor, and even the rescuer?
Yes, and these switches can happen very quickly. For example, if the victim feels the rescuer isn't acting according to their expectations, they may suddenly become the persecutor, accusing the rescuer of being cold or uncaring. Similarly, if the rescuer feels their efforts aren't recognized, they might slip into the victim role, feeling overlooked or unfairly burdened. This creates a cycle where everyone is trapped in the psychological system, making it very difficult to break free.
Wow, it sounds like an invisible psychological vortex that can pull anyone in. How does this triangle affect people around them?
Its impact is profound. Jung warned that if this triangle spreads to a group or even society, it can become a destructive force. Many social movements or ideologies may originate from real injustice, but over time, the victim identity can solidify as a moral authority. The focus shifts from solving problems to maintaining the victim status. Imagine an entire society being subtly guided by this invisible psychological control. That's the real danger of the pathological victim.
I see. So the rescuer role can also be dangerous? I always thought they were just people trying to help.
In fact, rescuers are often the easiest to get pulled in and can be the most destructive. Because they intervene out of empathy or a desire to alleviate suffering, they often unintentionally perpetuate the cycle of powerlessness and dependence. Many rescuers derive self-worth from fixing others, which creates toxic mutual dependence, making the triangle even harder to break.
So rescuers think they're doing good, but they're actually fueling the pathological cycle?
Exactly. That's why Jung emphasized the importance of psychological awareness. You need to recognize which actions truly help, and which unconsciously maintain the victim's psychological power. Otherwise, even well-intentioned actions can be exploited, and you may become trapped in codependency.
Wow, so emotional resonance is part of the problem too?
Yes, highly empathic people are especially prone to getting pulled in. Humans naturally absorb and resonate with the emotions of those around them. Highly empathic individuals experience others' pain almost as if it were their own. When facing the performative suffering of a pathological victim, it becomes very easy to confuse genuine empathy with being emotionally manipulated. This is why developing discernment, the ability to balance empathy with boundaries, is crucial.
It sounds like this discernment is really important. Are there practical signs that can help us identify a pathological victim?
Of course, We mentioned 5 key signs before, and I can go into more detail to make them easier to observe. First, avoiding personal agency. Pathological victims refuse to acknowledge their own power and actively resist any opportunity for change. They always find reasons to say, "This doesn't apply to me." This isn't passivity, it's a deliberate rejection of change. Second, turning long-term suffering into capital. They convert their pain into identity and strategic resources, constantly emphasizing their misfortune, even using past suffering to suppress current disagreements. Third, moral impeccability. Any questioning is interpreted as persecution. For example, "You don't understand my pain. How dare you question me?" This is a tactic to manipulate guilt and moral responsibility. Fourth, self-sabotaging cycles. At key moments of potential healing, growth, or transformation, they create or intensify crises, resetting everything back to square one. Fifth, shifting responsibility. They project their emotions and life responsibilities onto others, expecting others to intuitively know their needs. If these needs aren't met, they respond not with communication, but with blame and disappointment, emphasizing real or imagined abandonment. This is the most subtle pattern, and the one that most easily traps empathic people.
Wow, these signs are really practical. But it sounds like you need to observe over a long period. You can't judge someone after just one interaction, right?
Exactly. Jung emphasized this. It's not about labeling someone, it's about cultivating mature relational awareness, long-term observation, maintaining compassion, but without falling into codependency. That's how you truly protect yourself.
So, when facing someone like this, what psychological strategies can help us avoid being manipulated?
First, maintain clear boundaries. Know what responsibilities are yours and what aren't. Second, develop discernment. Distinguish genuine emotional engagement from manipulated emotions. Third, build psychological immunity. Stay empathetic without letting their psychological influence control you. Fourth, avoid spiritual bypassing. Don't ignore manipulation just to appear kind or forgiving. Fifth, practice self-observation and reflection. Accumulate long-term awareness so that even when facing a pathological victim, you remain clear-headed.
This is really practical and actually reassuring. At least now I know the psychological mechanism exists, and I know how to protect myself.
Exactly. Psychological awareness and discernment are your strongest tools. Remember, people with a victim mindset may seem fragile, but behind the scenes, they wield powerful psychological manipulation. They can use our kindness and empathy to gain influence. If you know how to identify them and maintain boundaries, you can avoid being pulled into their trap.
That's it for today's content. If you found this discussion enlightening, remember to like, subscribe, and share it with friends who need to understand these psychological mechanisms. Next time, we'll continue exploring deeper secrets of psychology and teach you how to protect yourself while maintaining genuine empathy and mental health.